welcome to the creative community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is filmmaker Peter Sturken. Peter, welcome.
Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. We're going to look at a lot of the work that you've done as a kind of a photojournalist, as a video journalist. We're going to talk about your work with Direct Relief International, and we have some really terrific material to look at. But I always like to ask guests how they found their way into their chosen endeavor. How did you become a person involved with film?
Well, I was living in New York, and I was studying at Columbia University, intending to become an English teacher, a teacher of English, and I was taking a master's in the 16th century and working at a bookstore, and I said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
What I want to do is get into filmmaking, and I went to all the networks and various film production facilities in New York City, and nobody had any time whatsoever for me. So I wound up working for a camera rental place called Florman and Babb. And they put me on the camera bench because they were goons back in the lighting department, you know, having to schlep these huge lights around and so forth. And they said, okay, we'll put you on the 16mm bench. So I learned 16mm cameras and then 35mm cameras, you know, as a technical thing of managing a camera. And one day, a producer of television commercials came in and said, I want to make an independent film. Would you guys shoot it for me? And I said, sure, we'll shoot it. And
when is this year-wise?
Oh, well, late 50s, I guess. And so none of us, I had some friends who had come in from Princeton University who were doing a film for Princeton, and they said, sure, we'll shoot it, no problem. And I said, well, have you ever even seen a 35mm camera? We were going to shoot with a 35 Arri, and I said, well, I'll train you up on it, and one guy can load the magazines, and the other guy can push the buttons, and we'll do the film, and I'll come out on the weekend, and we'll finish it. So we went out to Fire Island and shot it. It was, it had an actor in it, Chris Jones, who went on to a quite successful career in Hollywood. In any event, through that, I got into television commercials at Benton and Bowles in New York. And I did that for a couple of years, producing television commercials in New York City. And then I got just totally fed up with it, and I said, I've got to get back to Beirut, which is where I'd taken my bachelor's degree at the American University of Beirut.
Okay.
Yeah. And I missed Beirut. My wife was from Beirut. And I really did miss the Middle East, and I missed Beirut, and I thought, heck with it, one way or another, I'm going to get back to Beirut. So I made the rounds of the networks again. This was in the spring of '67, and NBC said, well, if you're in Beirut, you know, give us your phone number, your contact details, and if anything comes up.
All right.
Yeah. So I went to Beirut in May of 1967, and on the 6th of June, the '67 war started, and NBC said, we'll put you on the 6th Fleet. So they gave me a camera, they flew me to Rome, put me on the 6th Fleet, and I was on the 6th Fleet for the entire duration of the '67 war, and that's how I got into the news business.
That's a pretty big way to jump right into it, isn't it?
Well, it was an American story. The whole American side of the story of the '67 war was the 6th Fleet, because the planes were going out on patrol, and at the end of it, we came alongside the SS Liberty, which had been hit by Israeli warplanes and very badly damaged. You know, over 30 American sailors were killed, and what it was a communications eavesdropping ship, apparently. But anyway, it was a big American story, and I got interviews with kids coming off the Liberty who were being, you know, buoyed across. And the long and short of it was that it sort of established my credentials as a news cameraman. Because if you're on a big story and you get a lot of airtime, people notice it, and
you keep on working, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I want to stop there. We've got you sort of biographically into the experience of being a correspondent or a camera person. Let's take a look at some of the stills that we have, and then we'll come back and we'll look at some of the television footage that you have. So you just kind of talk us through what we're seeing. Okay,
this was in Egypt. That's Peter Jennings, and I used to delight in catching Peter at odd moments. One time, for instance, we were doing a stand-up on a hotel balcony. He had a perfect jacket and tie on and so forth, but he was in his underwear, his shorts. Right. So I just did a slow, you know, he finished the stand-up and I did a slow pan down, and there's Peter saying, what are you doing? I said, I just, you know, and I would always catch him out.
No, he looks like a poet bent over his typewriter in the middle of the desert here, yeah.
But the thing about Peter was this was his this was just a couple of years before he died. We had lost touch for many, many, many years, and he said, "Why don't you come and have a visit?" And we had no idea that he was going to become terminally ill within just a few months of this photograph. So we went and had a great time with him. My one regret about that was that I didn't bring up the war and his tacit support for the invasion of Iraq, which I felt very, very strongly about. And I felt that all of our media had let the American people down by not opposing that war, or at least getting the facts about what got us into that war more out in front of the American people. And Peter was, you know, he was very much listened to and highly regarded, and I think that he could have stepped up and done a much more vigorous job of getting all of the facts about Iraq out before we went into that war.
What do you remember about him as a person, as you working with him for a number of years?
He was a lot of fun to work with. He was a little self-conscious with me because
he shot his underwear.
No, he hadn't graduated from university, and I had my bachelor's and my master's degree. And very often on a story, you know, I felt that I might know a little bit more about it than he did. So there was always this sort of competition between Peter and myself, in my mind at least, because you know, not that I threatened him in any way, but it was a lot of fun working with him, though, because he would sit down in the desert like that, and he would write, you know, a minute-and-a-half story. He said, "How much have we got?" And I'd say, "Well, I'd probably get a good minute and a half." He would sit down, write a minute-and-a-half story, first draft, and just narrate it straight to camera. It was one of the most impressive performances. You know, I worked with a lot of correspondents, but Peter was very fluid in being able to sit in front of a camera and tell a story, just, you know, just off the cuff.
So you're there with the camera, and he has just memorized this piece that he's just written? Is that
he wouldn't even well, see, usually you would do an opener to camera, and then you would read the rest of the track, so that would become the narration. But Peter would, anytime you put a camera on him in any situation, he could immediately start very cogently and fluently about it. It was a brilliant capability that he had. And that was why it was a lot of fun working with him. Of course, one of the depressing things about working with Peter is that if there were 10 girls, like one time we were in, we were in an elevator in the Cairo Hilton, and about 8 stewardesses, a Lufthansa flight, and all the girls came in from the bus, and they got in the elevator, and they all turned towards Peter as if he was like sunflowers, you know, towards the sun. And I'm saying, "Wait a minute, I'm here too." Peter was. He was so, you know, girls, he was a girl magnet, I have to say. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, let's go back and look at some more photographs here and see what we got. What have we got here?
This is King Hussein. Peter and I had gone to Jordan. This was during that troubled period in the late 60s after the '67 war. And we went and did an interview with King Hussein, who was, you know, I think a great advocate for peace in the Middle East, and a very interesting person to talk to. I mean, he was very personable and very forthcoming, and wasn't standoffish or anything like that. He made you feel immediately at home. And the funny story there was that I had everything set up out on the lawn, and the sound man was pacing back and forth, and Peter was way down at the other end of the palace garden, and the king comes out. And the sound man is caught between me, am I ready? Peter's all the way down at the other end of the garden, and here comes King Hussein, you know. But we managed to get it all together, and the king laughed it off, and we went on and did the interview. So it was fun. And this is Anwar Sadat. I did an interview with him. This is the palace gardens in Cairo. We, in fact, managed to do a lot of the key players in the Middle East. We did Begin, for instance, and Sadat, and King Hussein, and Arafat, and so forth. So it's as a news person, you would very often evolve a perspective on a story that you might not have as any one of the players, any single one of the players, because if you're talking to all the players and visiting all of the countries, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, you begin to see a broader perspective, I would say, on it. And I think that's a newsman's duty and obligation, is to convey that very broad and wide-ranging view of a situation, so that you get a very, a good idea of what is really happening there from the various players' viewpoints. Because if it's distorted one way or another, it's not serving the American people's best interest in my mind.
Well, I want to pause there because we were talking before, and I wanted to ask you about the difference between the way that foreign affairs are covered when you were doing this back in the 1960s and 70s, early 80s, and now. You just mentioned the fact that you felt that Peter Jennings had not stepped to the plate and been as forthcoming about information as people had the right to have had. How do you make the difference between then and now?
Well, the time I was talking about Peter would have been,
recently, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But the way that you covered the Middle East then and the way it's being covered now?
I feel, to be honest, I think it was more honest in the old days. I think it was more because you had people like Peter out in the field so that they would convey the gravitas of a situation. If he reported from a Palestinian refugee camp or from an Israeli kibbutz or wherever it was, if Peter told you what was happening there, you tended to believe what he was saying because, he lent credibility to that. I think what happens a lot now is that you get only one side of a story. Let's take Iraq, for instance. I think the whole Iraq story is being told from the American perspective. Muqtada al-Sadr is a terrorist. Well, he's a whole lot of other things also, and we're not doing in fact, one of the stories on the video reel is primarily with the Druze, who were a minority group in Lebanon, and who were fighting for their own rights in Lebanon, but they happened to be allied with the Palestinians, and they were sort of vaguely leftist and wound up opposing the Americans. Well, they were very pro-American in terms of believing in the American way, the American people, and so forth, but they wound up on the wrong side of a political equation and suffered for it. I think then that we tried to tell the story from their side. We also told it from the American side and the American troop side and so forth, and that's the way it has to be. It has to be all sides of a story should be told. And I think that for some reason there's an anti-Shiite bent now because of Saudi Arabia and so forth. And there's a whole story there about the Shiites. They're the majority in Iraq. Hussein persecuted them mercilessly throughout all that time. Of course they're allied with Iran because Iran is Shiite and Iran is supporting them. But they are Iraqis, and they are Iraqi Shiites, and they're quite ready to stand on their own 2 feet. They will take whatever support they can from Iran.
And you feel this is a story that's being underreported,
I think the story, let's hear all sides of the story. And in fact, one of the great things about the internet now is that there was a blog coming out of Baghdad called Baghdad Burning, I think it was. It was a young girl who was in her early 20s, very fluent in English, who was telling the story of what it was like to be, she was Sunni, obviously well-educated, well-spoken, but her family was in Baghdad. And she told the day-to-day events of what it was like to be on the receiving end of the shock and awe, for instance, the lack of water, a brother not coming home. But the only way you ever got a feeling for that was going to that blog, Baghdad Burning, and her name was River something. And how many people went to that? You would have to be convinced and interested to go and find that and look at it. But it was so wonderfully and terribly moving and intimate. You felt, what the heck finally happened to this girl? And what did finally happen was they became refugees and went to Damascus, and she gave up blogging. But, the wonderful thing about these times today is the news, you can find the news out. You can, if you look for it, you can find it. The sources are there. People can go to blogs and hear all sides of opinions.
Right. Well, and ratings would show us that people don't rely on the evening news in the way that they once did, obviously.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's go back and look at some more photographs. You got so many great things that you've been a part of.
This is Mullah Mustafa Barzani, and he was the leader of the Kurds when I went there because I wanted to do my own, this was my first independent documentary film. And the Kurds were in revolt against the Iraqi government at that time. They're the guys up in the north of Iraq, and they're a separate people. I think they're sort of more like the Armenians, or they're not a non-Semitic people. And I went and did made a half-hour documentary about the Kurdish revolt and Barzani's role in it. He was quite a hero for the Kurdish people, and the thing is that they had the potential of being developed. I interviewed engineering students and so forth. They had a great potential for independence and self-determination, which was being suppressed by the Saddam government. And in fact, it wasn't Saddam government, it was Saeed's government, I think. But Saddam, in fact, was the minister of the Interior. So he was directly responsible for what was happening to the Kurds.
Well, I'm going to pause you here because I'm going to alert our folks in the booth. If we could roll that in just a minute, the Kurdistan, Iraq video that we have, that's what you're talking about. But go ahead and keep going.
Well, we see now, because the Kurds do have an independent, and they have their own integrity now in terms of a geographic area, that they've managed to develop that part of the country, which is you know, it's riven by mountains. I mean, there's a lot of water up there, but there's very little agricultural land. And it so happens that Kurdistan borders on the oil regions there. You know, I just wanted to do daily life in
What are some of the challenges of taking this footage?
Well, this was a hell of a thing because I had to go in through Iran. I was smuggled up to the border because I was being smuggled into a sovereign country, which was Iraq, except it was controlled by the Kurdish, the Kurdish rebels up in that area. And so they met me in a town near Tabriz in northwestern Iran, and they smuggled me into Kurdistan with my equipment and so forth. And I spent two weeks riding around on a mule to get out to these places. Well, I mean, they had very little transport, and the only way you could get out there was actually literally on a mule. So they took me out and they looked after me. The net result of that whole thing was that the war didn't break out. It was a very wet spring, so I didn't have any combat footage. I went back in the fall to get combat footage to get the film I was trying to sell to NBC and the various networks. And I went back in the fall and I got my combat footage, and then I managed to get wounded.
Oh.
But the Kurds, then what happened was we were on a mountaintop, and the Iraqi army moved up to just above our position. I got wounded as I was trying, to get away from the Iraqi army. So I was literally under the Iraqi guns. Luckily, it was nightfall, and everybody disappeared. I shouted out water a couple of times, and people shot at me because the Iraqis were afraid of being ambushed. And then I heard, "Peter, Peter." And two Kurds had come back in the night across this mountaintop to carry me on their backs out from under the Iraqi positions. I mean, I can't imagine a braver thing to do, and for somebody who the hell knew who I was,
Well, I think in that piece that we just saw, that you really kind of established the dignity of the people. There's a real sensitivity to culture. I mean, I think that's a beautiful clip, albeit though it's brief.
Yeah.
But this is part of a 30-minute.
Well, what you find with most people, I mean, we tend to demonize people, and the fact of the matter is that most people are basically decent, I think. And most people worldwide, and I'm talking about Palestinians or Shiites or Druze or Kurds or whoever, Iraqis, they have a great admiration for America. I mean, all of them feel that America is the land of opportunity. One time I was doing, right after the Marine barracks were hit in Beirut. Mm-hmm. Because I could speak a little bit of Arabic, I was delegated to go down and get the other side of the story, which in this instance was Shiite kids who were in a neighborhood just opposite the Marines in Beirut, who were not in any way involved in the bombing of the Marines. But I got the local commander. He comes out, he's in Adidas exercise gear. He's got a Kalashnikov in his hand, running shoes on. And I said, "Well, what's happening?" He said, "Look, we've got nothing against the Americans, but we have our own fight here in Lebanon, and we would like to carry it on as we must carry it on without outside interference." They saw the American presence there as being an outside interference. When the interview was over, I put the camera down. He comes up to me, he says, "How can I get a visa to the United States? I want to go and study." And I thought, it rendered my heart, this poor guy who had so little future there, and the one thing he wanted to do was
come to America.
Come to America and study,
Well, I want to go back. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. I would love to look at this clip we have of India. It's from early 1970s. Yeah. I think Howard K. Smith is the announcer, and then they cut to you guys. Yeah. So I'll give them an opportunity to get that set up. But maybe you can tell me a little bit about this before we jump into it.
Well, what happened was that there was the Indo-Pak War and the establishment of Bangladesh, and we decided to go back a year later and do sort of a India Today kind of things, and the sound man that I had with King Hussein had actually gone to India and toured all of India on a Vespa, and he came back to Beirut and he said, we've got to do India. So he talked to Peter, and off we went to India. And we did probably 8 or 9 stories in India. And one of them was about the second city, which is the clip we have here. An Indian architect named Charles Correa wanted to construct a second Bombay. There's a peninsula, you know, sort of like Baja California.
Right, just along,
yeah. And he wanted to do a whole new city on the other side of this body of water to relieve population problems and so forth. And what strikes me about the stories we did in India was that they were very ecologically conscious. They talk. Peter talks about.
He mentions that, yeah.
Yeah, he talks about population. He talks about food in some of the pieces, water, and all of the concerns that are now pressing so forcefully on us were expressed back 40 years ago. You know,
okay.
It's.
Well, let's take a look. Let's cut over here, and we'll come back to the studio in just a couple minutes.
The problem of urban population growth is not confined to any special area of the world, but it is critical in countries like India. There are predictions that the city of Bombay, for example, will double its population within the next 10 years. One possible solution to such massive growth is simply build a new city. ABC's Peter Jennings reports.
Imagine, if you will, 500,000 people living in this immediate vicinity and 2 million more spreading themselves along the base of those hills. The business and government center of a brand new city, nestled in this valley and along the edges of this bay. Imagine, if you will, a brand new city. Suburbs, government, business, industry, all here on what until now has been Indian farmland in Indian villages. An American conservationist might well be horrified. That is, until he saw the alternative.
In 1972, Bombay is choking, being strangled to death by the same urbanization process which swept America 60 years ago. Bombay's problem is that of almost every major city in the closely watching underdeveloped world. 6 million people today, 12 million in 10 years, in 20 years, 60 million. Charles Correa, an Indian architect trained at the University of Michigan and MIT, says simply, build a new city, and to start with, move 2 million people in the front door.
What we're trying to do instead is change the land use pattern. In other words, we want to say, why do people have to go all the way to the southern end to reach their work? Why can't we have another work center, new work centers? So this is really what the new city is about. The idea is to generate jobs right here on this side of the harbor, and to do it on a scale which will act as a kind of counter-magnet to Bombay. We are building a metropolitan city like Bombay. We are aiming at about, as you know, at about 2 to 3 million people, which is about half the growth expected in Bombay over the next 10 years.
In old Bombay, transportation is overcrowded. Whereas most cities devote 30% of the land to roads, Bombay devotes only 8%. The new city guarantees leisure green areas. The old city has practically none. In the old city, sensible control has failed. A building boom, yes, a modern skyline testifies to that. But the building boom has so overcrowded the land mass that there is nowhere left to grow. Some of the poor are obliged to steal their water from the city's main pipes. The pipes don't service their part of town. The new city will contain a modern docking facility, and again Bombay Harbor will provide jobs and commerce. Each new development is designed to help the city pay for itself.
For all its ambitiousness, the new Bombay is really only buying time. As populations increase, new techniques must be found to reduce what will surely be new pressures. What it does do is indicate to the underdeveloped world that one simply need not continue just grafting makeshift solutions onto already existing city structures. Peter Jennings, ABC News, Bombay. Are you tired of fighting your way through lunchtime restaurant crowds only to get a bad meal? Are you tired of carrying your lunchbox and only eating cold sandwiches? If you are, you might be interested in a system they have in Bombay. This is a tiffin box. In America, we'd call it a lunchbox. Our friend on the bicycle is a tiffin wallah, or delivery boy. The tiffin box's owner went to work many hours ago. Now, through some miracle of organization, thousands of tiffin boxes and hundreds of tiffin wallahs will guarantee hot lunch for Bombay commuters. Tiffin wallah number 1 will pick up 15 or 20, They'll join hundreds of others waiting to catch the 1102. We tried to follow one. The Tiffin-Wallahs are usually illiterate, but have never failed to understand the signs on the boxes. It was Greek to us. Churchgate Station, Bombay. It was here that for us the problem began to assume mammoth proportions. We regret to report that in all of this chaos, we have lost our tiffin box. I suppose the solution is to follow another one. If a tiffin box was ever going to get lost, now's the time. But ask anyone in Bombay and they'll tell you Tiffin-Wallahs Incorporated never makes a mistake. There's a 3-course home-cooked meal in each of those tins, and by the time it finally reaches its owner, it will have passed through as many as 7 sets of hands. And so, Charu Ta gets her lunch. And we conclude one day in the life of a tiffin box. Have you heard of any computer breakdowns lately? Peter Jennings, ABC News, Bombay.
That you have passionate views about politics, about people, about the world, and you're involved with Direct Relief International. We may or may not have a time to show a brief clip of some work that you've done for the Tea Fire, which is the last weekend from the time we're taping right now. But tell me how you found your way into that work and basically what DRI does and is.
Well, I had retired basically a couple of years ago. I was with ValueClick for a while, and I was kind of their internet cop, but they retired me out when I was 66. So I did recruiting for a couple of years, and believe me, calling up people and trying to convince them that I've got just the engineer or the software designer. Boy, I tried it for 2 years and gave it up. And so I have my own website, which is erecipes.com, but I wanted to get involved with a local NGO that I felt was doing good work worldwide. Mm-hmm. And I went to Direct Relief International, and I was all set to pack boxes and so forth, and roll bandages, whatever. And Kristen, the girl on the desk, said, "What, man, let me see this resume again." She said, "Maybe you should talk to Jim, our media guy." I said, "Sure, why not?" So I talked to Jim Prosser, who's the media person out at Direct Relief International, and they had some good video from the field. They had stuff from Bangladesh and from Cambodia and from Africa, and they wanted to get short videos of various projects that they'd had in these countries, and they had the video footage and stills. And they had a good editing program there, so I thought, what the heck, I'll try. Exactly. And they gave me free rein, and I love working there and volunteering there because the ethos at Direct Relief International is of the world vision, the world view, the impartial view of situations and peoples worldwide. They worked with a woman in Afghanistan, for instance, who was very, very...
We're showing the Tea Fire here.
Yeah, this is the Tea Fire, and this was quite a triumph because we shot this on Friday morning just to get something on the website, and CNN picked it up, and it ran on CNN, so we got very good exposure for DRI. And DRI has actually pre-positioned emergency relief supplies at various schools around Santa Barbara and also in the Gulf area. Wow. And the DRI is moving now towards pre-positioning supplies in critical areas that might be affected by flooding or by fires or hurricanes or whatever, so that they're acting in a sort of in a proactive move. And they've been selected as or been adjudged by one of the leading assessors of NGOs to be the most efficient NGO in the country.
Wow.
Out of 10,000, yeah. They have a wonderful record of impartiality and getting into situations quick with the right stuff. They have hurricane packs now that are in ice chest size cases so that they can ship them down to an area that's struck by hurricanes or cyclones. All the necessary supplies are in that case. That case can be put in the back of a car, taken out to some other area, or even carried by 2 people to a critical area, and that's the only way you can get that stuff out there. And that's the kind of things that Direct Relief does, because they have people on the ground at those places.
Well, my camera person is saying that we're just about out of time. People can go to the website, obviously, if they're interested in
directrelief.org, yeah.
Thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Well, it was great fun.
Creative Community is produced by Santa Barbara City College in association with the Santa Barbara Channels. I'm David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.